Americans for Safe Access is celebrating our 23rd anniversary. For over 2 decades, we've brought medical cannabis stakeholders together to meet the immediate needs of patients while addressing knowledge, policy, and regulatory gaps, clearing the way for a national medical cannabis framework that serves all patients. What you may not know is that ASA has been women-led since I founded the organization in 2002. For ASA's 23rd anniversary, I've created this series of interviews of remarkable women who have shaped my view of medical cannabis and are working alongside ASA to fulfill our mission. My goal is to share the inspiration that these women have brought to my life with new and seasoned advocates alike. I'm honored to present the women who crush, the women who get shit done. It is very fitting that I'm kicking off this series with my interview with Alice O'Leary Randall. She's been an amazing mentor to me over the years, but she is the original OG. She is the grandmother of medical cannabis. Every time I talk to her, I learn something new, and I'm inspired and reminded how many people before us have put their blood, sweat, and tears into this movement. Hello, Alice. How are you?
Hi, Steph. I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm finding joy in this project. So sometimes when things get crazy, you gotta look and find your joy.
Yes, you do. Happy to be here.
Hey, so 50 years. What does that feel like? Holy moly.
Wow. Some days it's the blink of an eye.
Mm-hmm.
Other days it seems like 500 years. So it
That's
all
okay.
depends on the day. November of 2026 will mark the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the medical marijuana movement. So that's what I'm working on these days.
I love that. Well, any way that ASA can help you get that message out, it's the work that you and Robert did is really, the core, feel like, of what ASA does, that we're really carrying in your footsteps and the work you guys started. So let's start there and tell us how you got involved in the fun world of cannabis.
Oh, well, I got involved the old-fashioned way. I got busted. We back in 1976, it wasn't an option to choose whether you wanted to be in the cannabis movement or not. I mean, it was a. I'm pretty amazed when I speak at conferences now and look out at people and realize, you all chose to be here. But in 1976, we were growing marijuana because my husband Bob, Robert Randall, had glaucoma, and he had accidentally discovered that marijuana helped lower his eye pressure. So to kind of get us through those dry spells when we couldn't get anything from a dealer or a friend, we thought, well, we'll grow a few. We'll grow a few plants, and unfortunately, we got busted. Or maybe fortunately, we got busted. At the time, it seemed like the end of the world, but really, it turned out to be a wonderful thing. It's been a fabulous experience for half a century. So we fought the charges against us, and Robert was found not guilty of possession of marijuana by reason of medical necessity, which was based on the common law that was established in the Magna Carta. So it was a unique defense, and at the same time, we petitioned the National Institute on Drug Abuse to get the federal supplies of marijuana so Robert could treat his glaucoma. And both things came together in November of 1976. He was found not guilty, and he got his legal marijuana from the federal government, and it was huge news. I mean, we didn't have 24/7 cable in those days, but if we had had it, it would have been even crazier than it was. But he was the only person in the United States, probably in the world, to be legally using cannabis for medical purposes. And it just took off, and we went for the ride. It was pretty amazing because obviously cannabis, the medical uses of cannabis are not rocket science. There were plenty of other people. I like to say that whether Bob had existed or not, medical cannabis was going to happen because it's so obvious. And of course, this 80 years that we've been in here with the prohibition and whatnot, that's the aberration in history. And so, once Bob got his marijuana, we started hearing from other glaucoma patients, multiple sclerosis patients, people with Crohn's disease, people with cancer. And bit by bit, the movement started to come together. And that's how it all got started.
Yeah, it's really amazing in talking to people who are in the cannabis space, whether they wanted to or not. I feel like cannabis also chose me. I'm a medical cannabis patient, and that my neurologist brought it up to me, and was the most amazing day and one of the most life altering, since it's changed the course of my life. But that people, that they're like, once you learn that this is working, that there's sort of a calling, right, to help others. And so I'd love to hear, like, how did it come from Bob getting the cannabis from NIDA, because it was a investigational new drug program,
Mhm.
actually, it becoming such a big program and more patients enrolling. Because this is usually that piece of history that you just said is,
Right.
is often like a sentence maybe in people's history of cannabis, if
Yeah.
even. And so I'd love just to hear more about like how
Yeah,
you
well,
got from those two talking points.
yeah, no, that's a great question because it is something that kind of gets lost in the shuffle of history. Um, Robert got his legal marijuana in November of 1976, but in January of 1978, the federal government took it away. They figured out, they literally enticed Bob's doctor with a very lucrative research grant, but told him he had to move to the University of North Carolina. We were in Washington, D.C. at the time, and Robert couldn't remain his patient. He had to drop Robert. So the federal government lured away the doctor, and we looked around for another doctor with no luck. It was a very stressful and grim time for us. And so Robert did one of the things he did best. He went to the press with it. And from that, we managed to link up with one of Washington, D.C.'s largest law firms, Steptoe and Johnson. And they agreed to take on Robert's case on a pro bono basis, which means free. And that was really, we went from despair to ecstasy in 60 seconds. It was pretty astonishing when all that came together. And they spent several months preparing a legal brief to file with the government to get Robert's marijuana back. And essentially, they made the argument at that time that if a woman has a right to have an abortion, then surely a man going blind has a right to a medicine that he has proven beyond a doubt that it works. And so they prepared this up. There were quite a few hiccups along the way. At one point, the federal government said, well, you have to go down to North Carolina and try this new drug called Timoptic. And until you try Timoptic, we're not going to give you your marijuana back. The Timoptic failed. But we had to go through that little drama. And then finally, we had all the pieces together. The suit was filed with the U.S. Attorney in District of Columbia, and within 48 hours, the case was settled. Now, I think that shows just how powerful a brief it was.
Yeah.
They didn't want to go to court with this one, but they had to create a program whereby Robert would get his marijuana on a conventional basis with a doctor. He goes to a doctor, he gets a script, he goes to a pharmacy. And in order to do that, they developed the investigational new drug, the compassionate investigational new drug program. And the investigational new drug is a standard FDA thing that all drugs go through. So that wasn't anything new. But the addition of compassionate IND, that was new. And so Robert was the first and for several years the only patient in this compassionate IND program. But it did eventually lead to others receiving legal cannabis from the federal government, people like Irv Rosenfeld, L.V. Musikka, George McMahon, Barbara and Kenny Jenks, Steve Loop, all of these people were brought into the federal marijuana IND program via the compassionate IND. It was a very important development, not just because it was continuing to save Robert's help, but we were able to take that compassionate IND, and in the 90s, when the AIDS crisis was upon us, we took the compassionate IND and we started a project called the Marijuana AIDS Research Service, or MARS.
Nice.
And AIDS was a very unique disease because it had such a similar set of symptoms in almost every patient.
Mhm.
So that gave us the opportunity to take this compassionate IND, which usually was a pile of papers like that would scare any doctor in his right mind to run away. But we were able to condense it down to about that. And the doctor and the patient could fill it out in about 20 minutes. And so, using MARS, the MARS program, we announced to the general public that we had these compassionate INDs available. If any AIDS patients wanted one, all they had to do was contact us. Well, they flew out the door. And we were very fortunate at that point. We had a benefactor by the name of Richard Dennis who broadcast this for us. He actually set up a closed TV announcement of it to all AIDS clinics and AIDS associations throughout the country. Well, we couldn't keep them in the house. We kept mailing them and mailing them and mailing them. And then eventually somebody from one of the groups called and said, "Hey, can we just Xerox this ourselves?" Yeah, good idea. Go for it, please go for it. Um, we have no idea how many of those ended
Wow.
up at FDA. We assume several hundred, at the very least. They approved 30 of them before they realized what the, what was going to happen,
Right.
and so that put the Bush number one, George H.W. Bush. It was his administration. And this literal assault that we had established through Mars to go after the INDs, it just threw all of their drug policy into well, they didn't know what to do. A significant part wanted to shut the program down.
Yep.
Others were saying, no, you can't do that. These people need this. You can't do that. But they, of course, were the very small voices.
Right.
It's a long story, but to make it short, they succeeded in closing down the program. They grandfathered in about 15 patients who had received the marijuana from the federal government until they died. But the rest of the people, too bad. Sorry, you're out of luck. Well, that's what led directly to Prop 215.
Yeah.
People were so angry about the way AIDS patients were treated by the federal government that in California and San Francisco, especially, they started with Prop P, which was a
Mhm.
very local
Yep.
measure. They went to I think it was Prop A in Santa Cruz County. They won a county. And then, of course, they went to the state and won Prop 215. So, you know, a lot of people think it all began in California,
Right.
and I love California. But there was a lot of people before California, a lot of steps that paved the way to California. And
Absolutely.
it was an exciting time. It was really a very exciting time to be part of that.
Wow. And I hear it's interesting sort of how history trickles down and like the sort of
Mhm.
pieces of history that people put in their PowerPoints or their talking points. But
Right, right.
we're talking about like decades of work that you did, right, to keep this
Mhm.
program moving. And when and just the case law around when the Bush administration closed it down. I hear people often say, they refer to that program as like some big hypocrisy that the federal government says it's illegal, but they give these few patients. And really, and the reality is that, with there are patients' rights within those IND programs that if a pharmaceutical has one and they decide to stop, that they're not going to take it to market, they actually have to continue to give those patients that drug, which is why
Mhm.
the federal government had to keep giving them marijuana. But
Right.
there was a state component to it, correct? Because you guys
There
were
was
working a
a
state, like the states had to
state.
be involved in the compassionate program in some way. Is that right?
Yeah, sort of, kind of.
Yeah. So I know you guys did
Yeah,
a lot of work in the states.
in 1978, there was a young man in New Mexico by the name of Lynn Pearson. He was a cancer patient, and Lynn and Bob became fast friends. And it was actually Bob that suggested that Lynn try going to his state legislature and see if the state of New Mexico would pass a law allowing the medical uses of marijuana. Well, they did. um, Lynn became just this one person lobbyist, and he literally pigeonholed every legislator in the New Mexico Assembly at that time, saying, "Hey, we've got to help the cancer and glaucoma patients." And mostly, he really got involved because he found out that it worked really well. He was getting his chemo through the VA hospital, and he told other people getting chemo, "Hey, you need to try this. You'll be able to tolerate the chemo better." And they wouldn't do it because it was illegal. And that's what really set his course. And that, Steph, you'll find that throughout the medical cannabis movement. It's always somebody's doing it for somebody else. Yeah, great. Oh, it's great that I'm getting it, but I know my friends now are going to get it as well. It's that kind of really quite astonishing affection and caring, and a sense that this is wrong and I have to make it right. That's really important too. So Lynn got this law passed. The problem with the law, it recognized medical use, but then they decided they'd go to the federal government and get the marijuana from the federal government. Well, the federal government didn't like that idea at all. And it's quite a story. I'm not going to go into all of it here because it was a long, hard struggle in a relatively short period of time. But there were a lot of twists and turns and whatnot. The important part of New Mexico is that 33 other states looked at New Mexico's law and said, "Hey, that's cool. We're going to do that in our state too."
Right.
And between 1978 and 1981, there were 34 states that enacted laws that recognized the medical utility of marijuana in treating cancer and glaucoma. Now, only 5 of them were able to wrestle marijuana from the federal government. And then the federal government concocted the release of what's now known as Marinol through the National Cancer Institute Group C program, which allowed a lot of people to use THC before it was finally approved. But that took the wind out of our sails. And
Okay.
cancer was the big focal point in those early days of medical cannabis. And the government went out of its way to say, "Oh, well, we have this pot pill. It's just like marijuana, but you don't have to smoke it. Isn't that cool?" Well, of
Yeah.
course, it wasn't anything like marijuana at all or cannabis. Um, but the country wasn't very sophisticated at that time in terms of their knowledge about cannabis. And people bought it. And let's face it, most people who are ill really don't like smoking. They just don't. So they thought, "Oh, this is great. I can take a pill." Well, it didn't take long before that bubble was burst. But it had done its job. It had taken the wind out of the sails of medical cannabis movement. And then the next thing that happened was Ronald Reagan came to town and with his wife Nancy, and just say no. The parents' movements, all of that just kind of really clobbered the medical cannabis movement for a while, frankly. And But those laws were passed, and a lot of people don't know about this, and I have figured out why. And that's what Project 50 that I'm working on is about. During COVID, I was writing an article, and I wanted to get a quote from Robert's first legal case, U.S. v. Randall. And I thought, okay, I'll get it online somewhere. Well, I couldn't find it online. I couldn't find it online. I could find it behind paywalls
Right.
at legal services. But that's not right. I mean, you should be able to find that. And then I started looking for information about Lynn Pearson from New Mexico, about Mona Taft from Georgia, who did the same thing in Georgia that Lynn did in New Mexico. And I couldn't find these things online except at newspapers.com. And then it hit me that all of that work, the 20 years from 1976 to 1996, that was pre-internet.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Right. So it's all analog. Whereas everything from 1996 on is digital. And of course, 96 was when Prop 215 got passed. So I think that's a lot of the reason that people think it all began in
Yeah, I think, yeah,
1996.
yeah.
So I'm making it the rest of my life's work right now, to digitize as much as I can, to get it up online, and to make it available to people. And I started with our autobiography from 1998,
Mhm.
and I digitized it. I added links to it. That was another example. It was passed in 1998. Um, Kindles came along in 2007, but by that time, our publisher sadly had gone belly up.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was never available in a Kindle version. So now it is. It's available digitally, and best of all, it's available free. It,
Fantastic.
it it's at my website www.aliceo'learyrandall.com, and you can get I've decided that all of the digital items that I'm doing and that I'm going to do will be available on my website for free. Um, that's how we started out.
Yeah.
Um, we never charge people for information, and I think that's how I'd like to go out. That, I'd like to see it getting out there, rather than making a few bucks here and there. I want the information to get out so that people realize what a movement this has been and how spectacular the patients were who laid the groundwork for Prop 215 and for all of the blessings that we have today, which is not to say it's perfect, but we got millions of people legally using marijuana medically, legally, and that's tremendous. So,
No, absolutely. I think I love that you're doing that. I feel like ASA, I feel like we're the historians in a lot of ways because even what's online, the story, a lot of people take credit for the work that patients do, right? A lot of people that are going to profit off of the consulting or whatever that piece is. And
mhm,
I know, whenever this work gets hard, that over the last, we're about to turn 23, ASA is,
great.
but during this period of time, I know hundreds of people that the last weeks of their life they spent in courtrooms, right?
Yes,
Protecting
yes,
people. They
exactly,
spent their literally the last days of their life in state houses trying to
hmm
get these laws passed. And, you know,
exactly.
you can't, I feel like you, as an activist, you can never ask of others what you won't do yourself. So
Hmm
I've
hmm
seen I've witnessed just the most amazing people and including yourself. And I love that over the last 2 decades since I've known you that you're always willing to share your story, always willing, no requirements, no paywalls uh to hear that
No,
history. But you really Robert really set a tone with not just how you interacted with the courts, because I think one of the largest issues with the war on drugs has been that there are so few people that say not guilty, right? That it really is just a perpetual system. Most people, like 98% of people, plead guilty to their drug charges, and it just has become a spoken. The work that Bob Randall did also inspired like Valerie Corral in California
yes,
to say not guilty when she was charged at the state level,
right.
and also was a part of the spirit of passing Proposition 215. So the
Absolutely.
the impact and the ripples of the work that you guys have done, I hope you see it. I know there's some days where it can be hard to see the good, but yes, at the end of the day, there's over 6 million people using medical cannabis. FDA and HHS have said that there's currently accepted medical use in the United States, which, yes, of course there is, but it's nice to hear someone say it. But you guys also, before I forget, you guys also got Newt Gingrich to introduce legislation, right?
Yes, we did.
One, and no one ever talks about. I ran into Newt in like I'm his best friend. I call him by his first name. I ran into him at an airport once, And
Oh, okay.
he's a very, and I had met him one other time in his office when he was in Congress. And he's like remarkably genuine. And he remembered me, which is always like he's a politician's politician. And
Mm,
I said, you know what? I was just reading about the legislation you introduced around medical cannabis, and I'm just wondering if you could tell me what, like, why you're no longer involved in it. And he said, well, you know, I met patients early on, and I felt like I really wanted to help them. But then he said, I couldn't see a way to that medical cannabis could move forward without engaging in the harms, right? Without sending a mixed message, is what he said. And he
mm,
was very genuine, you know, I said, okay, because I wanted to know like what happened, right? And he was very open about it. And he said, you know, and he actually, this was maybe a decade ago, and he said, I think you can see that's what's happening now. There's a lot of misinformation. And I was like, okay,
yeah,
interesting.
interesting.
Yeah,
Well, I'm happy to give you the backstory.
yeah, please, please do. I love that.
Um, you know, I like that that's a really nice story that he's made, but what we were thrilled when we got Newt. I mean, he was a nobody when we got Newt. He had just arrived in Congress, but it was clear that he was going to go somewhere.
Mhm.
And his mentor in Georgia was a gentleman by the name of Verlin Smith, who was a highly respected legislator in the state of Georgia. At one time, he was Speaker of the House in the state of Georgia. And it was Verlin that got Newt interested in the medical cannabis issue because Verlin had been approached by the widow of a cancer patient, by the young woman by the name of Mona Taft. And she wanted to get a law passed, like the New Mexico law. She wanted that passed in Georgia in honor and memory of her husband. And so Verlin, who was a cancer patient, he had beat it, but he knew cancer. He took on this project, and he got helped get the bill passed in Georgia. And Mona, in the meanwhile, had contacted us and become one of our allies. We put her on our board of advisors of the Alliance for Cannabis Therapeutics. And at the Alliance, we got Steptoe and Johnson came back again and agreed to draft legislation that would have legalized medical cannabis federally. It would have established an Office of Medical Marijuana Control or something like that. And you know, it was all there in 1981. And Verlin said, well, I'm going to call my young friend Newt and see if he won't get behind this. Well, Newt did. He was one of four co-sponsors who initially introduced the bill, all Republicans, and all of them true conservatives, really not any of this neoconservative stuff, but they believed in states' rights and they believed in personal rights. And sure, if you're sick and you have a medicine, oh God, yes, you should have it, absolutely. So things went along great. We got the bill introduced. It had at one point 110 co-sponsors. It was introduced for, I think, uh, 4 or 5 sessions of Congress, 2-year session thing. Um, but then around 2 years into it, maybe three, Newt suddenly pulled back.
Mhm.
And the reason he pulled back was one, Verlin Smith had died.
Mm,
So he no longer had his conscience.
interesting. Yeah.
The parent groups, which were very active at that time, which were Nancy Reagan's little allies out all around the country, were very active out of Georgia.
Yep.
And they put a tremendous amount of political pressure on Newt. And, you know, Newt is the only one who pulled back. Of the 110 co-sponsors that we eventually had, he's the only one who dropped out at one point, at that point. And so, you know, I knew it has a nice story too, but he
And he did mention the parents. He said that the parents had approached him that they couldn't tell the difference. But yeah, that's interesting. And I think, you know what, I mean, I find, you know, not, you know, I know that a lot of people say this, but if you don't understand the history of where you've come, you're doomed to repeat those failures. And I think right now what I'm seeing, especially with the adult use space, is I'm really seeing a potential repeat of ignoring parents, of ignoring the youth, right? So, for instance, you know, there's the deregulated space, of the hemp world, but there's also a lot of products that are being marketed towards children.
Yeah.
And I think what's most important is that there's no information being put out by the businesses that are producing these products of how to approach youth. So what else is there, right, except for parents? And so, if you
Right.
dig deeply into who these parent groups are, they're really sincere. They're not like, they're not political people. They're someone who, like, their child killed themselves, and
Mm-hmm.
cannabis was involved, and they're really trying to make sense of it. In a way, they're activists like us, right? They don't want another parent to have that experience, and so you look at that period of time with Carter, where Carter was about to decriminalize cannabis,
Mm-hmm.
and really the movement ignoring these parents and underestimating them, I think was a real problem. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing that today, that the cannabis community is making fun of them, isn't providing some help, right? Like they're the ones producing these products. I mean, and I think
Yeah.
that's the businesses like to call themselves an industry, but I don't think they're an industry, right? Industry is like they take care of the future of their businesses, right? And
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
alcohol, they fund MAD, right? They fund programs and put out information around teen alcohol use. Like they take that responsibility. So, um, but I
Right.
can talk to you forever. And I said I would just
Yeah.
keep you for 30 minutes, but I just want to give you a minute to, if there's anything you'd like to leave us with, some final thoughts. We'll definitely put Project 50 up on our website and make sure people know how they can get involved there. But I would love
Right.
to know any of your thoughts about, where we go from here.
Uh, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about where we go from here. And you've laid the groundwork for me in your comments because the industry is really full of itself at this point. And I don't think we're ever going to go back to where we were 50 years ago. God forbid that should ever happen. But that doesn't mean that the federal government can't step in, or some group or some state government can't step in and make life hell for people. Um, I'm very concerned with the state medical programs that seem to be in trouble in more and more states. I read a fascinating article from Massachusetts Live the other day about how dispensaries in Massachusetts are getting farther and farther apart, and you can have an adult dispensary right down the street, but you can't get your 20% tax off because it's an adult place instead of a medical place. Um, Medical dispensaries deserve a lot more tax breaks than they have and a lot more support than they have, because it isn't as simple as going into a big box store and taking the other brand because the brand you like isn't there. It's just not that simple. And anyone who can tell you that it is doesn't get it. And quite frankly, there's a lot of people out there that don't get it. I find it very frustrating. I know if Robert was here, he'd be on the road beating the drum about this because it just we fought so hard to
Yeah.
get these medical dispensaries, and they're in danger, and we do have to rally around them. They need our help, they need our support, and we've got to get into the states again and to the regulatory boards and keep them from usurping this wonderful service for the seriously ill and just putting it into, I mean, what in Washington state, medical dispensaries are controlled by the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco? I mean,
It's
come
true. Yes,
on.
it's true in a lot of states. Actually, a lot of the states, they're merging the adult use and medical altogether. And I think
Right.
for me, I think that yes, I mean, we built that legal framework for the dispensaries. It is very hard to see them be pushed aside,
Hmm.
on one hand, but I think it also that maybe we've outgrown the state by state system, that it's time for a national medical cannabis program. It's time to get out of the geo-fenced world, and
Yep.
time for
I think
patients to
that,
have been protected under the American Disabilities Act. It's time for us to finish this fight.
Yes, and I think that's all true, but recognizing our current political climate, it's it's really hard. It's really hard. And when Bob and I started out, we had one enemy, the federal government.
Yeah.
And there really has been a little divide and conquer here going on with DEA allowing all the things to set up and whatnot. Nobody's looking at the federal government. Well, I think we need to turn some attention back to them, and they need to get out of the way of medical cannabis. And this silly thing where FDA studies CBD for 2 years and then can't figure out how to regulate it. I mean, give me a break. Oh my God. How many things do they already regulate? And they can't figure out how to regulate CBD. It's just, if you don't laugh, you cry. I've
So
done both.
true. Well, thank you so much, Alice. I
You're
appreciate you.
welcome, Steph.
Thank you for fighting and creating this space. And without the work that you
My
and
pleasure.
Randall did, I might not be here, right? My doctor might have not have brought cannabis to my attention, and I'm just so honored and grateful to have
Well,
worked with you.
likewise, it's the fight's going to go on for a lot of years after we're both gone, I'm afraid. So just we just got to keep on keeping on. That's what it's all about. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alice.